Mama,
Hello and welcome to Chats, a television podcast, Season 8B, RootsChatz, the next generation. My name is Alan, and I'm joined as always by Magellan.
Hey, what's up?
Good evening, my son, my sweet child.
Good evening, my father.
There aren't a lot of podcasts out there with like a father and son, now that I
Dynamic.
think about it. Yeah. Can you think of any?
Oh, no.
I know like the My Brother and Me guys have had their father on their podcast before.
On the Adventure Zone, I guess. That's
Yep.
like father and sons. But I can't think of one that's like, hey, father, son, hanging out. I guess that's the problem, right? Is that men
Fathers
don't
and sons
talk
don't
to each
talk.
other.
Exactly, you got it. Exactly. I recently subscribed to the podcasting subreddit, which is pretty fun because it's a lot. It's actually the majority of it is people being like, "Is there a podcast that does this hyper specific thing?" And people finding like really cool examples of that stuff. So it's like fun if you want to just let your podcast backlog explode and melt. I saw one that was like, is there a podcast where every episode covers a different American president and talks about the good, the bad, and all the stuff that they did? And someone was like, yes, it exists. And it's called Presidential. That's a plug for another podcast. It's like from 4 years ago, so it was right when Trumbo started. They like did it on every guy. And apparently it's decent. I think it's from like the Washington Post or something, but I like that podcasting is just one of those mediums where you can like roll the dice, right? You can say, I want a podcast where it's two girlfriends talking about painting. And you're like, yeah, that probably exists somewhere in some language. That's enough navel gazing for now. It's time to talk about everybody's favorite television show, Roots. Specifically, Roots, The Next Generations, which we're going to be covering for the next couple of weeks as we transition out of talking about the base 1977 Roots. Magellan, Roots, The Next Generations is an interesting backstory. Because the original Roots was based on Alex Haley's 1970-something novel. I know exactly what year it came out. It's 1976, you guys. Come on. And the second half of that novel...
Fake right there.
Thank you. The second half of that novel wasn't covered in the original series, so with the success of original Roots, the miniseries, they did The Next Generations and like got a big budget. I think it was like $16.6 million, which is about triple the original. And they used like most of the same production company, and they made a 7-episode, all 90 minutes, following basically the character of Tom Moore and Chicken George, that part of the family, all the way down to Alex Haley himself.
Yeah.
So,
and it's actually based on. It's kind of interesting because there's like far less of the book that covers this stuff. It's only 7 chapters from the original Roots, The Saga of an American Family, out of, I think 30-something chapters, I'm not sure.
Wow.
And then the rest is based on Alex Haley, like, dictated tons and tons of his memories of stories from his family into a tape recorder, and then the Ernest Kenoy, the guy who wrote the scripts for TV, took all of that stuff and made an outline of the series based on that.
So it's interesting because we talked in in the last Roots chats how once we get past Chicken George, they actually have like historical records of these people existing and could use real names. And from what I understand, they still didn't. At least the names and some other like factual errors were not even addressed. They stuff like Carrie and Jim Warner, 2 characters in this, are not Warner and Barden, but are actually James Turner and Carrie White. So they changed names, changed like relationships to other people. what I think my overall feeling before we get into these first two episodes is that Roots: The Next Generations feels like a period drama more than it feels like a miniseries. And that's
interesting.
A really subtle differentiation, because when it's a miniseries, it feels like the subject is mostly the time period and the sort of environment that it takes place in. Same like when we covered Pride and Prejudice, that's like what these miniseries are often about. But Next Generations is more specifically about like these characters, this specific town at this specific time, and what happens here. And it lends a sort of more personal, like intimate, I guess, feeling to the series. And then, by episode 2, when we're going to be going on to the next generation, it's like, oh yeah, this is Roots. I forgot that like this is the same series with, Kunta Kinte coming on the boat and Chicken George like losing all of his money and all of that stuff. This is still the same storyline being told. And so it's a different feel. I think we both agree that these felt like a little bit slow compared to original Roots. But that in part is also because we're focusing more on sort of structural problems than like physical attacks on humans.
Yeah, it's also moving through time more slowly, at least these first two. Because I guess part 1 of the original Roots is a pretty small span of time, but it feels like after that you're sort of every episode there's like a time jump in the middle of the episode or something. But in this, I mean, the entirety of what we watched only stretches a 15-year span from 1882 to 1897.
Yeah.
So yeah, it definitely does feel more focused, and we're also staying in this one town. And you could certainly see like a prestige drama called, I don't know, whatever the name of the town was, that's about all of these like, oh my gosh, love in the time of post-slavery type of thing.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And I think I found at least the beginnings of the original series more compelling than this, but I think there are still quite a few interesting and important things that we can discuss out of what we saw in parts 1 and 2.
Yeah, exactly. And we can get right into it if you're down. This first episode, part 1, has a teleplay by Ernest Kinoy, and it was directed by John Erman, and it aired February 18th, 1979. So once again, they did the like one episode a night thing, at least for these. I don't know if they do that for the whole season. But John, what happened in part 1 of Roots: The Next Generations?
In this episode, Tom Harvey assumes the leadership of the black community in Henning, Tennessee, from his aging father, Chicken George.
Now, while it is pretty short, I think that summary kind of gets right to my take on this first episode, which is that, like I said, Henning, Tennessee, while a pretty interesting, like, sort of place to get the pulse of what at least the American South was like in the late 1800s. It really takes a while for your brain to like adjust to the different pace and style of this series, because it's like, okay, here's your new ensemble, here's like the people that you're going to see for the rest of the show, even though it's only 2 episodes, and you remember Tom, you remember Chicken George and Irene and those characters, but now we have like a whole new class, so we have them. We have Tom, as you mentioned, is now sort of a bigger member of his community and is attending a meeting of the Republicans of Color, which I wanted to ask you about, sort of where America is at politically in the late 1800s in terms of like the term Republican and what were the parties that were being voted on.
Yeah, so it's kind of it's a weird question to answer, I think. So essentially, last episode that we saw, we were pretty solidly in the period of time known as Reconstruction, which lasted from 1865 or so through to 1877. And Reconstruction is the period following the Civil War, where in many different ways the United States is trying to rebuild following that conflict. And during that time, you have a group of Republicans in power in Washington who have an explicit interest in civil rights. They're called the Radical Republicans. And at first, the process of Reconstruction, when it's heralded by Abraham Lincoln, is he's more interested in compromise with the South and kind of like, let's bring them back into the country quickly, put this behind us, and we're not going to ask for too much. So his plan for Reconstruction is, okay, we'll ask them to pass the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery, and then we'll say, like, 10% of the citizens have to swear loyalty to the U.S., and that's it. And the Radical Republicans are like, what the fuck are you talking about, Abraham Lincoln? Like, they just declared a war to protect slavery. They committed treason. There has to be a bigger response than that. Lincoln ends up getting assassinated.
Which we heard about in the last episode.
In the last episode, right? Then Andrew Johnson takes power, and he is a Democrat. He's friendly to the white Southern governments. And so there's a slight period of regression during Reconstruction before he's ultimately, Congress wrestles power away from him. And then you get Ulysses S. Grant, who's sort of willing to do whatever the Radical Republicans are asking him to do. And so for a while, during that period of time, there's a military occupation of the South. The federal government is building schools throughout the southern states. There is the highest proportion of Black representation in government, I think, of any point in American history, to be perfectly honest, before or since, at the local level in those states. Because you have some states where, ex-Confederates are barred from running for office, and this newly enfranchised African-American population is voting for other African-American people. So there are some states that have like majority Black legislatures.
Whoa.
During Reconstruction. It was a couple. There were some that even had Black governors. I think Louisiana is one of the states that had a majority Black legislature during Reconstruction. And so that's a context to keep in mind here, that that is how this could have gone and how it went for a certain amount of time. But if you are a white person who just fought a war to preserve slavery, and then you see that now African-American people are enfranchised and holding public office, you're like, no, this can't stand. I'm going to fight against this. And eventually the northern government grows kind of weary of continuing to enforce Reconstruction. So in the election of 1876, the Democrats and the Republicans strike a deal because the Electoral College vote is a tie. Mm-hmm. And so it has to go to Congress to break the tie. And the Democrats basically agree, like, we'll let the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes be the president if you take troops out of the South. So that's a long-winded way to say that during Reconstruction, the Republican Party is pretty strongly correlated with like being pro-civil rights and pro-Black enfranchisement. And the Democrats are maybe not vocally anti that, but they're certainly not for that. But then following 1876, when we get into the period of time in this episode, you're in the Gilded Age, and neither party really has any sort of strong affinity for civil rights. The Republicans are benefiting from African-American votes because Lincoln was a Republican, right? And there's still that legacy of like Republicans, Reconstruction, that kind of association.
I want to vote for the Lincoln Party because I'm a
exactly
African-American.
And that really doesn't change until like FDR is when that starts to shift. But in the late 1800s, Republican, Democrat, it's kind of indistinguishable because both parties, maybe this will sound a little familiar, but both parties are essentially doing the bidding of their corporate overlords. Yeah, I know. Can you imagine?
No, what? You're being crazy.
And so you have African Americans in the South who essentially feel politically abandoned following Reconstruction. And so that, I think, adds some context to Tom Harvey's decision in the first episode when you see the meeting of the Black Republicans who are like, maybe we should strike a deal with the Democrats. Maybe that's where we're going to see the best benefit, because it's just a matter of like, who is going to actively support us, protect us, and help us. And party isn't really relevant anymore.
Fascinating, especially when you consider, like where the party system in America is at right now, in the sort of division along lines of things like civil rights and human rights at this point.
Yeah. And I get students asking a lot, like, oh, the Democrats are the Confederates or whatever, but they're the good guys now. Like,
oh
what?
No, oh,
how did
sweet
that happen?
Children.
And it's a complicated thing, but essentially, there's a period of time where there isn't really a strong party affinity for civil rights, and then things change in the 20th century.
Oh, I can't wait. I can't wait for them to grow up and for this show to get there too. Because right. I think, like I was saying earlier, the political backdrop of Roots, especially now that we're in this point where America's changing so quickly on a political scale, and like with the elections and the importance of being able to vote and disenfranchisement, stuff like that, you're seeing more like the adult characters in this series can actually make small and large scale changes to their world and instead of just like, people are trying to survive, people are trying to fight for their freedom. Like now the fight for freedom is happening in politics and in government, and it's really just fascinating to watch that shift happen.
Yeah. Something, a wrinkle that I forgot to mention. Yeah. Two wrinkles really. So the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. But when the radical Republicans are steering Reconstruction, they add two further stipulations to Southern states re-entering the Union, and that's the 14th and the 15th Amendments. The 14th Amendment is the one that guarantees equal protection of law, which we'll see violated in a sort of loophole-y way later in this episode when we start talking about Jim Crow laws. And then the 15th Amendment is constitutional protection of the right to vote for all men regardless of race.
Which we'll also see violated in the second episode.
Correct.
Yes.
So this period of time that we're going into, the 1880s, 1890s, and the early 1900s, some historians passingly refer to that period of time as the nadir of race relations, the low point of race relations. Because we have this conception in American history that it's like a straight line of progress, right?
Yep.
But that's not how it happens. There actually is pretty startling progress during Reconstruction, and then a pretty startling backlash that's both legal and extra legal, as we were talking about last week. And it shows up in a number of ways in these two episodes. And then the other wrinkle, this is kind of a fun thing, and I don't know that I'm going to express the claim with historical precision, but I think there was a certain interest by Northern politicians in abandoning the civil rights protections of Reconstruction because they were seeing the potential for those like civil rights protections to also apply to immigrants in the North.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of like, well, if we want to oppress this group of people, we need to sort of allow for the oppression of African American people in the South so that, both regions can have their sort of labor class.
It's only fair.
Right. And again, I didn't express that entirely precisely, but that's in the mix as well.
Yeah, it's a pretty tumultuous time, and like you were saying, this is not a linear story of progress in America. America's not historically like working straight towards objective improvement, I don't think anywhere is really. And I think that's really well reflected in Roots because, while this episode feels a little bit more kind of cozy in the town of Henning, and like we get a lot more scenes with the white characters, and a lot of whom are not terrible, and it's not just like old George and his wife. It's like now there's a couple of like not like well-meaning, at the very least, white folks. The show never backs away from saying that even the nicest people, even your Tom characters, are still like, he has a moment with his mother later where he's like, and I do acknowledge that my whiteness makes me superior, but I love this black woman that I married. And you're like, no.
Yeah.
So, we're in a time when it's more common that they can eat together and laugh together and like play nice together in a way, but ultimately race relations are still in a really tough spot, obviously. And I think I want to talk about the Tom and Carrie stuff because it feels like a whole B plot. I think you had mentioned in your notes, like, starting in Next Generations, we're no longer just following the family legacy of Kunta Kinte. We're now like going to entirely different families who are related by their problems, and like the fact that they go to Tom and his wife to help them with things.
So there are kind of a couple love plots that I think actually, the theme that I sort of drew from this episode is the ways in which race complicates love during this time, and like who can be together and who can be seen together and who you're willing to accept into your family and those kinds of things. And we see it with like two different couples. So we can talk about, basically bigger picture in this town. There's this Colonel Warner.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Played by Henry Fonda. So again, Roots is doing its thing and bringing in some white folks that you recognize. And Henry Fonda has a couple sons, and we'll talk about his other son later, but he has this younger son named
Tom.
Is it Tom?
I have it written as Tom.
No,
it's Jim. It's Jim. Tom is the guy. Tom is the main character.
Okay, yeah.
It's
so
Jim.
He's got this son Jim Warner and
Jim Carrey. That's how you remember them. Nailed it.
Okay, so Jim Warner, and then new to the town is a woman by the name of Carrie, and her last name is Barden.
Good job.
Thank you. I'm looking at the Wikipedia page. So Jim Warner and Carrie Barden, she goes to the house of the Colonel to like introduce herself and to borrow some books. She's this new school teacher for the town. And what we learn, she ends up in a conversation with Jim. And it's a really well-written conversation, I think, because there are multiple moments where Jim like talks down to her and assumes that she's dumb, basically.
Yeah.
And then is like kind of too surprised when he learns that she went to college. She went to Fisk University, which is pretty new at the time. She says was in the second graduating class.
Right. Pretty cool that at this time you can be like, I'm the second one.
Yeah.
Ever.
So during Reconstruction, I mean, that's another thing that was going on, is the establishment of schools that we would now refer to as HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities.
Mm-hmm.
So you have Fisk, and I think around the same time Spelman and Morehouse and places like that. I'd have to get the exact years, but I think that they all generally were.
Was Howard around this time or no?
I would assume so, but I think we would need to check that to be sure.
Okay.
But I would imagine so. Yeah. So she's a graduate of Fisk University, and they bond over the fact that they both like poetry. And he's, I'm sure you love this.
You bet I did, bud.
When he's like, hey, have you heard of this guy, Walt Whitman? He writes some really sexy stuff. It's pretty hot.
Okay. John's a friend of the fact that I, especially in college, in my last year of college, I read Leaves of Grass and have since become like that person that never stops talking about Leaves of Grass. It's extra funny to me because I also have like introduced people I had a crush on to it, but like Leaves of Grass for me was like queer awakening poetry text, and like when he talks about it, he's like, it's about a man that loves a woman, and she's like, didn't he like just talk about like sex in general, like with some guys too. And he's like, no, it's like a guy and a girl. Like it's cool, it's straight. I swear. And I'm like, dude, it's not. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, he clearly is not fully reading everything that's in Leaves of Grass, which is also interesting.
Well, yeah, the passage that he reads is a poem that's about the death of Abraham Lincoln, and he's like, "Oh my God, it's amazing! Like we can all relate to that, right? Like we all felt so bad."
Anyway,
I hate him and I love him. Is what I'll say about this character.
That is a beautiful poem, though.
It is.
But not. Yeah. Anyway, so they bond over that, and then they have a few scenes together where there's this kind of like. He's really pushing to spend time with her and be around her, and she is very hesitant, which she explains later. We'll talk about that, but she's very hesitant to kind of get involved with this guy, but he keeps pushing himself on her, and he brings her the book, and then they go have a picnic together. And in the scene where he gives her the book, I found this pretty interesting. That he's basically, before he gives it to her, he's like, now, there's like a pretty big difference between us that might affect how you read this book. And
just like, for example, I don't know what it is exactly, but.
And I, of course, was like, oh, he's white and she's black. Like, that's what he's referring to.
Yeah.
And then she's like, you're referring to the fact that I'm a woman? And he's like, yeah, totally. There are just some dirty words in here, and I was going to cut them out with my knife. And it's like, what the hell?
She's like, no, don't ruin a book.
It's like a baby, and he's like, "Of course, you're so right." Oh my gosh,
what was I thinking?
But I thought that he was going to talk about the race thing, because there's some pretty stark, like, anti-racist stuff in Whitman, I think.
Yes.
When he's talking about singing, I mean, I Sing the Body Electric. It's about gender, but there's also a lot of race commentary going on in there, and that seems to have just totally gone over his head.
Yeah, that's the beautiful thing. This is the one place in this podcast where I get to be a little bit of the scholar.
Go for it.
A lot of this is like an important thing to understanding Whitman as a early sort of like progressive writer, is that not only did he write about like romance and love and sexuality, but also specifically wrote about like bodies, regardless of how big or small they were, and regardless of the color of their skin, are all beautiful and we're all part of each other. And while now that's like kind of crunchy granola bar philosophy stuff, that was a big deal at the time. It was like, wait, this guy doesn't even care. Like, he doesn't care. We're all like beautiful and capable of love and sex and like companionship. That's amazing. It was a very big deal because it felt universal for once. But I digress.
And he kind of, I think, Jim Warner kind of gets it, but kind of doesn't, which is interesting. So they end up having this like picnic scene where he goes in to kiss her and he tells her that he loves her. And I thought this was the most interesting exchange between them. Which I think then the episode actually like undercuts in a really frustrating way. But what ends up happening is he kisses her, and then she's like, "Oh my God, why would you do this? Why would you do this?" Everybody was assuming that I was like going around with you and we were having sex, and it was really special to me that this was a sort of like intellectual connection, that it's like a spiritual thing between us.
Yeah.
But she's like, of course, now I can't believe any of that because you're just another white man who thinks he can have his way with black women whenever he wants to. And I thought that was really, really powerful. And, it's a pretty important thing to acknowledge, like such a huge barrier between any possibility of love between white men and black women during this time is the legacy of the things we've talked about in previous episodes about, the ways in which black women were sexually abused and raped by white slaveholders and overseers and those people, that even though those practices ostensibly are no longer, located in slavery, that like relationship between those groups of people, that legacy is still there. And the worry and the fear on the part of black women is still there that white men are predators, which is kind of an inversion of what the kind of predation that was talked about maybe at the time, where a more prevalent fear among white people was the fear of black men preying on white women, and that's used to justify legal and extra legal limitations to the rights of black people.
Exactly. That's what Birth of a Nation is about.
Right.
It's like we need to protect them.
Yeah, and it felt actually, from a cinematography perspective, there's a pretty famous scene in Birth of a Nation where a white woman is fleeing from a white guy in blackface because he's going to presumably rape her in that scene, and she flings herself from a cliff instead of that happening to her. And there's a lot of stuff in Birth of a Nation about like black men eyeing white women like, ooh, oh my goodness, yeah. And it felt like this scene where Jim Warner is chasing Carrie around after she says like, no, I don't want to be with you. He's chasing her and grabbing her, and she runs across the bridge. I definitely got vibes that they were like evoking Birth of a Nation to say like, well, actually, here's the power dynamic that you really should be looking at and worrying about.
Right. The show is trying to say that like it's not the way that the narrative was showing it. And I think that's one of the my favorite things about this character and the Jim Carrey stuff is that they don't just like blanket say that Jim is a cool dude and you should like him. You know, ultimately like they get married and they do stuff together and he has some moments of triumph, but there's always this undercurrent that the show never gives up on, which is that this guy is still working and living under a system that gives him supreme power over the woman that he chooses to marry.
Yeah.
It's cool too how we're gonna move on, but like this episode, and it seems like the Next Generations, especially in general, is showcasing more women, especially black women, like in major roles. I mean, the whole Harvey family, besides Tom, they're all women. I mean, and Chicken George also, but that's something that nowadays you see as a push. Like this show is successful because it's about black women, and this show is like, no, it's about a black family that just happens to be all women at the time, and it gives it this vibe like this is a story about women and what they are working towards, which is really great. Because even in Roots, when we had the Kizzy story, it was like about her relationship to a man, especially, instead of just like her relationship to her education and to society, which is what all this is about. So just something I noticed that I really liked. Yeah,
and it costs Carrie her role as a teacher, or it like almost does.
Yeah, this
relationship with Jim Warner, because the Colonel is that in the second episode or is it the first one?
When she loses, I believe it's in this one. Yeah,
they run away together because they can't be out in the open together here in Henning. The Colonel like disowns Jim. He calls him and the N-word, and he says that you're one of them now. And there's no way that they can have this kind of like public relationship. So she, I don't know, is she the teacher in the second episode? Does she permanently have to sacrifice that, or is that just a temporary thing?
I don't want to predict.
I don't remember. I don't know for sure, but it at least seemed that it could have cost her, or it did cost her, this position in society that she worked pretty hard for.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
and that allows her and affords her a sort of power, because being a teacher at this time is she only teaching like African American children?
Yeah, I believe so, yeah.
Okay. So it is still like you're able to, you're a teacher as well. You're obviously a white teacher, but you're able to teach people like the actual history and like how revolution and how the rest of the history books are not being honest about a lot of stuff, or are masking a lot of the history of America. Like maybe that position gives her a little bit of power to be like, well, guys, here's what I have to teach you, but like keep this in the back of your heads as you get older. Which I think is something that Roots always reminds us, is that like one of the strongest things that the most powerful ways to fight back is to teach the next generation and make sure that they don't make the same mistakes that we do.
Yeah. Right.
So the Jim Carrey stuff goes. I can't stop saying it like that. It's bad. Basically he's trying to court her, and it's obviously not going well with his family, who don't support it in any way. His older brother just seems like I play Xbox in my room and I have Halo. Do you guys want to come and smoke weed with me? Kind of brother. Like at first he's harmless. He's just like, he has this weird girlfriend who's like kind of attractive, and they're like, oh, you guys are weird.
Yeah,
you're a bum.
They're driving around drunk in their carriage and all that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And at first when he proposes to her, it's interesting that she, like you said, we're saying, like, rejects him because she's like, I don't like feeling controlled in this partnership, which is fascinating because for a lot of reasons, like we were discussing, she's not doing this. She does like feel an attraction to him and love for him, but doesn't want this marriage to be like, and then you possess me in a way, which is again pretty progressive.
Right. Well, and because of the legacy of what that means for Black women and white men. Because I think she says later when she's talking to Irene that it's something that her mother told her, like, don't ever, I don't know, get involved with a white man or something like that.
Yeah.
And she has this moment where she's like, basically like, Irene, it's really eating me up inside because I really want to be with this guy. I'm really attracted to him and it's making me feel horrible. And Irene's answer is interesting. And I don't know, I'm torn about it, I guess. But she essentially says like, hey, those urges that you have, those are totally cool. Back in slavery times, as she says, one of the main comforts that people had was sex, is what she says. And be in love and being with someone.
You can jump the broom, you can get in bed together. That's the stuff that they can't take from you.
Yeah, and so she's like, that's godly, that idea of being attracted to someone, which I think is really beautiful.
Yeah.
But I do think that the show kind of brushes aside the concerns that Carrie has about like being in a relationship with a white man and what that means. I guess because he sort of relinquishes his family and his social standing to a certain extent, that's a resolution to that, but it doesn't feel like they ever fully resolved that tension.
Yeah, I wonder if their family and their situation is going to come up in the future. I doubt it, but because we're going to be moving presumably away from this town. But yeah, their stuff ultimately feels like it's just existing on the periphery, and it's like, hey, this is something that matters, that's happening. And, Irene is one of the major reasons that they go through with it. Yeah. And that they get married, but otherwise it's just like, hey, here's something to think about. Just that, this is why I was saying it felt like a period drama, is like there are just plot lines that don't tie into the main plot, but exist to make you think and consider something about history.
True. That's a good point.
Here's
something to think about, and then we can move to a different section of the plot.
Sure.
But earlier you said Jim Warner and Carrie Barden. Those aren't their real names.
Yeah.
Which is true. Also, it says here on the Wikipedia page that the whole Jim being a son of a colonel thing was not a thing. He didn't have a brother, and it was probably the case that the real people that this was based on, the Jim and Carrie this was actually based on, Jim may not have actually been white. He may have been mixed race, and there is some voter registration roll in from 1891 that identifies him as black. So so this whole plot is actually fabricated and isn't based on anything real, because there were most likely at the time laws against miscegenation, and so they wouldn't have been legally allowed to marry each other.
Is that interracial marriage? Is that what miscegenation is?
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. So that basically covers the Jim and Carrie stuff, because their plot line, I mean, there is a moment later where after they get married, they come back outside and there's a mob out and people are pretty intimidating, carrying weapons and stuff, including Tom, who seems like he's actually there not to start anything but to prevent anything from happening.
Mm-hmm.
And then they just kind of go off.
To be precise, miscegenation is like sex and between people of different races. So
I gotcha.
Interracial marriage is probably a more accurate way to say that.
Okay. I'm just trying to remember if anything else happens in that last part. No, I don't think so. I know that, yeah. It's just this stuff felt weird. I also legitimately thought that Tom at this point was like going to do something, but again, it's just like he feels, and this is great that this character, he feels like valuable enough as a member of the town that he's like, yeah, I stop fights here. Like, even though he's in his older age, he's not just like watching and smiling or watching and frowning at the world happening. He's still like actively ready to bear arms in a way.
Yeah.
But the other main plot that's pretty brief in this first episode, because there really isn't too much going on in this one other than like scene setting and like world setting, like we said, is the situation with Elizabeth, Tom's oldest daughter, and the man that she falls in love with, whose name is John. So John is mixed race as well. He's the child of black and white parents, and he seems like a pretty decent guy. I think that this plot line mostly kind of works to build to their relationship in the second episode. Because in this one,
we have a relationship. I thought he was gone.
Well, he does. No, he does leave. I'm saying in this one, but I mean like her. I'm sorry. I mean like the relationship between Tom and his daughter. Is what matters more. No, that was on me. I didn't specify. I kind of like said it in my head. Because what we learn here is that Tom is the kind of dad, there's plenty of people who are like this father type today who is very choosy about who his daughter marries. But in his mind, it's not just about, how much money do you earn? Where do you live? Who are your parents? It's also like, we worked so hard to get our own freedom. And he himself, even as a black man, believes that like they are invading the purity of our like family tree by doing this, and has to have this conversation with Irene, who's like, that you're a quarter white, right? Because Kizzy was raped by her owner. So you need to acknowledge that, and we can't erase that from our history.
Yeah, well, he doesn't even say that to her, I don't think. To his daughter.
No. I'm saying Irene tells it to
Irene
him.
says it to Tom, yeah. Yep.
So he doesn't mention it, but when she keeps begging, he says, no, this is my final thing. And at first, it seems like the classic, like, Dad, you're never going to let me marry who I want to marry. But it really does matter. Like, she is saying, this is the guy that I love and I care about him. And, he identifies more with the black half of his family and all of that. But too bad, end of the day, he's like, you guys aren't going to get together if you want to be with this family. And
yeah, because the reasoning he gives is that when he has experience with being on a plantation where African American people who were lighter skinned were given essentially better special treatment, felt that they were superior, or made to feel that they were superior to African American people with darker skin. And so he sort of has all this baggage from that's making him say, like, no, you can't marry someone who's light-skinned because of all these things. But like you said, yeah, Irene is like, don't you remember that you're a quarter white? And there's like a degree of bitterness and self-loathing about that I think is also present in him, like, banning Elizabeth from doing this.
Right, exactly. And I think it's really great, though, too, that Roots chooses to now have two relationships like that in this series, because even today, I mean, I have a couple of friends who are mixed race, and you definitely still get it's the endlessly like problematic frustration of, I identify with both sides of my culture, but when it comes to like racism and prejudice and stuff like that, people are always going to choose the part that they like less. All of my black friends are going to call me white, and all of my white friends are going to call me black, and I'm not going to fit in anywhere. Yeah. So, but in reality, it's like they've been around forever. This is just how it works. If we're going to go on the assumption, the true belief that the color of your skin doesn't matter, then your parentage should also not matter. But we're not there yet, and we're not there yet today either, which is like, again, super, sad to see.
Yeah.
But it's really good that they chose to make storylines about that, because you don't see that. You really don't see that a lot, even in this world today, where you see plenty, like more and more storylines about black characters and shows hosted and run by black folks. It's like, well, no, but like mixed race kind of gets in this corner of like, we still in some communities call them like the light-skinned ones and jokes like that, obviously in a bit of an ironic way of like, we know this used to be a problem and we don't care anymore, but it's still there. The prejudice is absolutely still there.
Yeah, right. And there's also colorism in our society, right?
Absolutely
Yeah. So shoot, I was gonna say something. Did you have more to say about the two of them? Because I have an interesting connection to another plot line based on that idea.
No, I mean, yeah, just him talking. There is that great scene briefly where Elizabeth yells at her Tom and shouts at him for being a Jim Crow and starts like saying, you know, you're a Jim Crow, Jim, and all that stuff. And then he smacks her. I was going to use that to pole vault into talking about the Jim Crow laws, but you can make your point.
No, that's what I wanted to connect.
Oh, beautiful,
to as well.
beautiful.
So we can talk about that scene. That scene was pretty chilling.
Yeah.
Because both of these episodes, it's really sort of like the tragedy of Tom Harvey to a certain extent. Like he just over and over again, life just fucks him over, and then he takes this, you know, he takes it out on his daughter in this really reprehensible way that I'm sure he's ashamed of in the moment. But because she's mocking him for almost going along with the colonel deciding to drive Carrie out of town for like being in a relationship with a white man. And it's this moment where it's like, hey, why are your priorities aligning with the former Confederate colonel guy? That's pretty messed up. So I thought that scene was really powerful for that reason. Jim Crow. So we hear, like you said, we hear mention of Jim Crow earlier in the episode when the train arrives and Tom Harvey has a first class ticket, but he's not allowed on the first class car and told that he has to go in the Jim Crow car.
The Gilded Age, everyone.
Right. So for folks who don't know, Jim Crow laws is the nickname that was given to segregationist laws in the United States from around this period of time up through the 1960s. So, you know, you actually see in the second episode, it's like pretty dorky, but there's a moment where someone is painting colored and whites on like the bathroom doors or whatever. Right. It's like that kind of thing. Or choosing where someone can sit on the bus and something like that. Mm-hmm. That's what Jim Crow laws did. We're segregating schools. Jim Crow, the reason it's called that is that Jim Crow was like a vaudeville character, blackface minstrel character mocking African-American people and doing the sort of standard vaudevillian mockeries of African-Americans of like they're lazy or, you know, whatever other stereotypes. And so that like that exaggerated dance that she does, I don't know if that's like a real Jim Crow song, but I would assume that it is. So that's where that's coming from. But yeah, so we see earlier that there's this tension over the train car situation. Mm-hmm. And the connection that I was going to make that's interesting, it is if you've heard of the case Plessy v. Ferguson, it's one of the most controversial Supreme Court cases in U.S. history. It was a case decided in 1896 that essentially established that public facilities which are separate but equal are legal. So the 14th Amendment says that everybody has to have equal protection of law, but the loophole is like, well, but what if we put people in separate places? As long as the separate things are equal, then it's not a problem.
That's fine, right?
Right. And Plessy v. Ferguson upheld that. But what's interesting as a connection here is that the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, the reason it was brought to the Supreme Court is that it was an act of civil disobedience by this man named Homer Plessy, who was not allowed to ride in the whites-only train car, but chose to anyway. I think it was even organized by the NAACP. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but it was organized by some group that just as the Montgomery bus boycotts, and just as Rosa Parks was like, she wasn't just some old lady who decided to sit on a different seat one day. It was like a planned action of civil disobedience. So it was a similar situation to that. And the interesting thing about Homer Plessy is that they were really trying to like push the envelope and show how absurd this is, because I think Homer Plessy was like 1/16 African American. But legally speaking, it's sort of like a drop of African American blood in the eyes of the law, and you're black and you go to the black car. So it speaks to what we were just talking about and thinking about with the position of people who are mixed race in this period of time, that it's like, I don't know, it's a complicated thing. But it's an interesting piece of trivia that I think people don't necessarily know about that case.
Yeah, I think one of the most valuable things that we can provide in this season of the podcast is that historical context for stuff that you may have not understood well or were not taught exactly accurately in school, whether you went to an American school or otherwise. There's like aspects of the history in this country that the show is like referencing but doesn't explicitly say, and so that's what we're here for in a way, is to help. That's why I'm so glad. It's part of why I'm so glad to be able to podcast with you as a study of the historical world, is that you're really smart. That feeling when I said I had 1/3 of a sentence ready and the other 2/3 were like, dude, I missed my bus.
I gotta go.
But anyways, so he has this falling out with his daughter, and that's where their situation ends. And basically, Jim's father says, you guys are going to get married in Memphis, but if you come back, I'm going to make sure that the, quote, white hoodlums in this town don't mess with you guys. And, I mean, that's why you get that scene at the end where technically they don't. They just do the even scarier thing of, like, surrounding his carriage. He's like, guys, I'm back. Welcome back. And they're like, what's up, motherfucker? And they just, like, encircle him, and it's so scary. But nothing, like, actually physically violent happens. It's just a moment of, like, we're ready to drop the tension bomb. Like, here we go. It's happening. And it doesn't happen in this episode. But that's where we're at. Also, just a side note. It is a bit of a side note, but it's also important. So Chicken George is recast in this episode.
It's so distracting, and they barely use him. I guess they were trying to stay faithful to when he supposedly died, but
yeah, they had to age him up so much they couldn't do the makeup on the other guy, so they just got an old guy.
Is that what it was?
Well, I thought because he dies in his 70s or something.
But they aged him up a lot in the previous series.
Well, then maybe then it was just a casting issue.
I think so. It just was. You didn't need to use him at all. I don't think he really added anything to the episode.
No. Well, okay.
He had a conversation with Elizabeth at one point, maybe.
Mm-hmm. He talks to Elizabeth. He basically, it's supposed to be a little sad because it's when you realize, like, if you've ever had, you, the listener at home, or Magellan, have had, like, older family members staying with you, and it's like, if you try to have, and I do recommend people who have that opportunity, like, try to talk to your older relatives just to see what the world is like from their perspective, because, you know, there's a lot of stuff that we take for granted that is just so fundamentally not in their brain, or because they just didn't grow up with it. So even he's talking about, like, wait, like, there's a white guy in town and you guys, like, somebody wants to get married, like a black one wants to get married to a white guy. That's weird, guys. I don't know. And you're starting to see, like, a version of Chicken George that has grown old and a little bit ignorant and is, like, starting to cloud even his own life story in his head. Like, he's starting to get mixed up. He's like, I won every single chicken fight and I was so rich and I was a free man, like, which is all true. It's pretty much true. But I mean, that and the way that they talk about, you know, the roots thing, you know, I call it, like, pulling a roots in my notes, is when they say, like, and you are the son of this person, the daughter of this person, and who's the son of this person, who's the daughter of Kunta Kinte, the African. And you're starting to see the Harvey family sort of distance themselves from his legacy, even though they still have a lot of respect for it. I would argue even more respect than a lot of folks have now for their ancestors, because they still name everybody even. But it also comes down to, like, the 2 bullet points that they remember about him.
Yeah, right.
Which is like, yeah, Dad. Like you, the 2 words that he taught us in African were like how to say bore and how to say this thing. And he was a great guy, and he led to this whole family coming here. We know, Dad. Like they're already there, which is sad, especially when we've seen and have spent 2 episodes of the first series with him in his own life, and like came to love, both LeVar Burton and John Amos's performances. And now it's like, well, he's the guy in the past. We don't even know about him anymore because it's such a huge time scale, right? But they are maintaining his legacy.
Yeah, sort of a huge time scale, but I was
not
actually
in the grand scheme of things. Yeah.
Yeah, I was actually struck by how close a lot of this stuff is historically. I mean, it is a huge time scale in the sense that like Elizabeth is talking about at this point, Kunta Kinte is her great grandfather, right?
But that's not that far when you say it like that.
But also like Alex Haley is, I think, Cynthia's grandson.
I believe you're right. He's only 3 generations away.
Yeah,
actually,
so it's not that far.
Really. The version of the Next Generations that I have comes with there was, I think, on the DVD that it's pulled from a family tree.
Oh,
it's like a really nice JPEG of a family tree. So yep, Cynthia, then Bertha, then Alex Haley. Yeah, she's his grandmother. Fuck.
Yeah.
I mean, he now has kids who are of childbearing. Like he's no longer alive, but his children are like adults now. So
yeah, but you think about like Alex Haley is an adult during the 60s. Like people who marched in the civil rights movement had great grandparents who were enslaved.
Yes.
So
yeah, I just saw like a video project from some news network a couple of years ago. I can try to dig it up somewhere, like buried in my YouTube history, but it was like audio from like the last generation of people who were enslaved in America.
Yeah.
And it was like, yeah, they have them on microphone. Like when like the last ones of them lived long enough to get to the point where we are able to like record video and audio and stuff. Ex-slaves talk about slavery in the U.S.
That was a project of, I believe, the WPA during the Great Depression.
Yes, recorded in the 1940s.
Collect these narratives, yeah.
So yeah, it's not that far.
Yeah, I had a similar thought when we see the train pull up.
Yeah.
And in my head, I'm like, we are seeing such rapid advancement and change in technology and such obstinate stagnation and even regression when it comes to matters of race.
Right. Well, those things, truthfully, those things work together.
True.
As long as race relations continue to stagnate, and what we can just call slave, we're going to call it. The truth of the matter is that it's slave labor is being used to jettison and quickly accelerate technological advancement. That's the reason that stuff is able to happen, is that they keep manipulating and exploiting labor like that. You do hate to see it, as the kids say, but we do that. It's a new form of slavery, but we get cool choo-choo trains, so it's okay, guys. No, it's not. Anyways, yeah, I think that's basically what I have here. I don't think I had any other dangling points.
Yeah, most of my stuff is on the second one, I think.
Well, let's get there. We'll be back right after this brief musical break to discuss the second part of Roots: The Next Generations.
Welcome back to RootsChatz. The second episode we watched this week was part 2 of Roots: The Next Generations, It was written for TV by Ernest Kinoy, directed by Charles S. Dubin. It originally aired on February 19th, 1979. Alan, what took place in part 2 of Roots TNG?
In this episode, and that'll never stop being weird to me, by the way, that it's Roots TNG, but especially because in like the previews that I have on my file, it's like they show the baby being lifted up into the sky, but it's like lit in like neon blue for some reason, and it looks like it's a Star Trek thing, and I kind of hate it. But no, I didn't hate this episode, because what happens in this episode is Tom Harvey's daughter, Cynthia, falls in love with Will Palmer, a railroad worker who soon lands a job at the lumber company. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what we call burying the lead. Fully. So Magellan, I'm curious what you thought about this episode, because, you know, as we watch Roots, we're watching about 3 hours of television a week. We run into often what's called second episode syndrome, which is a problem where when you watch a lot of TV in a row in a quick succession, you kind of like, it's hard to like keep critic brain on for that long, especially when the episodes are this long. Yeah. But I do feel that this one had some meat on its bones. So I'm curious, what you think?
Well, I discovered that there's also such thing as third episode syndrome, because I hit second episode syndrome probably 2/3 of the way through the first part, and then I hit third episode syndrome like a third of the way through part 2. So we had to have a whole conversation at the beginning of like, okay, let's make sure that Magellan understands what happened in these 2 episodes.
I mean, when I realized in doing that was that I almost didn't understand everything that happened too. So we're gonna we're not absolutely not going in blind. We both watched it, guys, but just a lot happens.
Yeah, it's just like you said, it's just a lot of TV to watch in one sitting or in one day. But I think we figured out the main things of it. So there was some stuff in here that I thought was interesting, but I had a harder time kind of figuring out what the overall unifying idea was of this episode. Because the first one felt so unified around this notion of like young love and the complications of that in a time when race is so complicated and mired in all of the legacy of slavery. And in this episode, I don't know that I as easily found kind of a theme. I guess maybe you could talk about this and compare Will Palmer to Tom Harvey and think about like kind of self-actualization and what does it mean to be free or successful and what's possible for a black man during this period of time. But even then, I don't know, something about the character of Will Palmer, I couldn't quite access him for some reason.
I wonder, because I had the same feeling about Will specifically, where I'm like, this guy is going to become the male figure. He's going to become sort of the Tom Harvey of the next episode, right? It's going to become like the Cynthia and Will story. Yeah. And so that means that like he's going to take on this role of not only a father but a businessman. And like, what does that look like? What does that character act like? You don't get a lot of like huge emotional range from the guy playing Will, which lends it this sense of like, I don't know, he just kind of feels like an apathetic dude who's walking through life. And that's partly because, you know, we're in the late 70s. We're in a time when TV acting was a bit more exaggerated. So he's kind of playing it more like you would today, where it's like, I don't know, I'm doing my best. I'm just trying to work hard. And that just doesn't gel with the rest of the series. But I still think that the story being told at the end of the day is good and meaningful. Because it's kind of picking up the pieces of where the last episode left Henning, Tennessee, and seeing where that evolves in August of 1896, which is where we're starting this one. We actually open on a funny scene where, so telegraphs exist. I don't know exactly when telegraphs were popularized and invented, but a baseball game is being communicated to a bunch of men in town through a telegraph.
They're like keeping score on the chalkboard.
Yeah, exactly. And they're like, that was a great game. Too bad. Then they start talking about like black folks trying to get into into Major League Baseball, and how some of them are like they'll never be as good, and some of them are like they're both obviously very, very, very racist ideas, but like some of them are like they'll probably be better because they are used to working hard, which is a really fucked up thing in the history of sports and integration in American sports, is this idea that like we would love to watch them play because they would be so good, and that is as fraught as saying that they shouldn't play, if not more fraught and fucked up. But so for some little bit of historical background at this point, later in the episode we see a like ceremony around with the older Palmer brother as he starts to run for office, and there's a American flag being waved around with I don't think it's 50 stars. I think it's a lot of stars though. It starts to look like the modern.
There weren't 50 states by this point.
But then this year, in 1896, Utah was admitted as a state. So they're getting there. They're still crossing. I don't know. When were Alaska and Hawaii added to the United States? Do you know?
I want to say like mid-20th century, but I'm not sure.
Okay. So yeah, we're definitely not at 50. But I was trying to like count the stars, but the scene was too short. It's the Cleveland administration. So we got Grover Cleveland here. And there's actually, when you like look at the like what happened in American history in 1896, a lot of train crashes. So they invented trains, and then a lot of them crashed into each other. Also, relating to the theme of like starting your own business and what does that mean for people, the Dow Jones was brought and it was introduced to the stock market in 1896. So they start having stocks, and the idea of like purchasing stocks exists now. Also, we're moving away from trains. Henry Ford is around doing his damn capitalist thing. He invented the Ford quadricycle, which was built in 1896. So that's the world we're at as these trains continue to run through Henning, and everyone's like talking about technology and stuff like that, and telegraphs. Cynthia is talking to Will and kind of having a little bit of a flirtation with him. And he, like I had mentioned in the first half, says that he has hesitation about proposing to her because he knows that Tom is not going to say yes to a man who doesn't have any upward mobility in his job. So he says, I'm going to wait. I don't make enough money yet. Cynthia tells him she's not getting any younger. That's kind of our setup for their whole conflict, or their whole situation here. Elizabeth is back after, I believe, 10 years or so.
Yeah, they say 10 years.
In Kansas City. Wasn't exactly clear if this was for work or for school or for what, but it's a long time for her to be gone, and you have to imagine that a big part of her leaving was inspired by the falling out that she had with her father, and in the last episode. And when she comes back, they have this very touching scene where George Stanford Brown continuing to kill it, even as playing this like drastically different Tom Moore. He's fundamentally the same guy. He says, it's not that I like. Basically, it's complicated because he's like, I am sorry that I said that stuff to you, and ultimately, if I prevented you from being happy due to the hate in my heart that I feel, that would damn my soul to eternal damnation more than anything else that I would have let you do. So I want us to still be able to love each other, which is nice.
Yeah, it's a touching reconciliation that they have.
Yeah, and you have to have that stuff because I think that conflict needs to kind of make room for a lot of other stuff that happens in this episode.
Yeah, right.
We have a guy here who's amongst one of the like awful white supremacist dudes in the town. Who I kept writing, he looked like a weird Heath Ledger. He's just one of those, like, he's got the sort of squinted eye look, like kind of, hey guys, I'm like really angry about black people existing all the time. And he's his whole goal in this episode is that he's trying to get rid of the black vote. He doesn't think that African Americans should be able to vote anymore, and it's frustrating that they can. This is also a scene where we're getting introduced to Will as like the business type. I think the other reason that we don't feel a lot of attachment to Will is most of the stuff that happens, it happens in front of him and not because of him. Like he witnesses a lot of history happening.
True.
There's a great scene where a guy quits the job at the lumber mill because he found a better job, and it's just Will being like, quitting your job. That seems like a cool idea. But instead he applies for that guy's job because he's trying to, make his way and make money. And then one of his friends, whose name is Lee Garnett. Lee Garnett is a man who's taken away on account of stealing from the guy who runs the lumber mill and taken away to jail. That's at least the sort of legal take on what's going on with him and why he was sent to jail. We learn later that it's more of a form of, what was the term again? I should have kept it handy.
Well, so he's taken to jail for stealing, but then we learn later that actually that guy owed him that money.
Mm-hmm.
So that complicates things. And then he's put through this system known as convict leasing.
Yes.
Which is another form, sort of another innovation of white supremacy, I suppose you could say, that took place during the late 1800s, where essentially, for folks who have seen the documentary 13th, that documentary does a really good job of explaining this, but within the 13th Amendment, there's this loophole that essentially says that slavery is abolished except for as punishment for crime.
Right.
Is more or less what it says. And so during the mid-1860s, you have southern states passing a variety of laws known as black codes. And essentially what those laws do is they make illegal these like kind of technical things, or just like things that aren't crimes, so that they can arrest, convict African American people, and then lease the convicts out to private corporations who will essentially pay the state a nominal fee in order to use the labor of these people who have been imprisoned. And so black codes, imprisoned things like loitering, for example, or being in town at a certain time, or whatever it might be.
Possession of marijuana, for a modern example.
Right. And so that many of those laws were struck down, but the system of convict leasing remained in the ensuing decades. And then you have Jim Crow laws and other ways to kind of feed that system. So Lee Garnett ends up leased out. I think he's like building a railroad or something. I don't remember what it is. Or no,
he's definitely doing some mining.
Or he's on a plantation or something like that.
I thought there was like dirt, as if they were doing mining on something. But I could be wrong too.
But all of those things were examples of things that convicts would have been leased out to do.
Can I ask you a history question?
Sure.
So, we like to talk about how a lot of things have changed, but not as much as we like to think. And obviously, I don't think they call it convict leasing anymore, but can you still, if you have like prisoners, I mean, they do still make them do labor, right? Is that still
Yeah,
a practice?
I'm not sure of what the laws are in different states, but something that is immediately coming to mind is when California was having those wildfires, and they sent prisoners to put them out, like they were using incarcerated people as firefighters. So that's still a version of this is happening in our society today. Yeah.
Okay. And then even like giving them just jobs within prisons, like production of like textile or
license plates or whatever.
Exactly. That's all this kind of thing. And then they get paid, but that's money that they can't use, or they can use like within the prison. It's like a whole complicated, deeply fucked up system. Yeah. But the show gets a little bit more, tilts away from that for now. We're not exactly in the like heat of that. And Will comes to the Harvey household to meet Cynthia's family, and he comes bearing gifts. There's a very, very funny scene where he gives something called cigarettes to Tom Harvey.
Yeah, which it's interesting historical note there.
Yep,
is he says it's the newest thing out of this factory in North Carolina, and what he's referring to is if you've heard of Duke University.
Yeah, of course.
Duke University was financed by this guy Duke, who made his fortune in tobacco in Durham, North Carolina.
Wow.
Yeah.
So cigarettes are becoming a thing, and it's very funny because like Tom is like sniffing the cigarette, because cigarettes have a different smell obviously than cigars, and it's like kind of a weird hyper technology. We're like, wait, they made it smaller and like it smokes different and doesn't work the same way. It's very weird to his like generation. And there's a very funny part because we actually have I think Tom and Carrie, or Jim and Carrie, are here as well. They're just like hanging out with the family, and someone says like, oh yeah, Will has something he wanted to talk to you about, Tom. And they're like, wait, oh, and then like everybody gets up and like dips. They're like, we gotta go. This is a private conversation.
Yeah.
And he is basically like, can I court your daughter? And Tom's immediately like, yeah, I'll think about it. For sure, I'll think about it. And later, like he's like very nervously asking him, like sweating and everything. You get Tom like trying the cigarette and he like practically chokes on it and all this stuff. And when like they go off, like Will's playing a thing on the piano with the girls, Tom and Irene are talking in the corner, and she's like, just say yes. And he's like, I'm going to say yes. I just didn't want to say yes right away. I want to tell him that I'll think about it, because that's the kind of guy that Tom is. But also he's saying that this guy Will wants me to free his friend Lee Garnett from prison because I have connections. So that's where they connect to the other plot. And this is then when we cut back to the story of Jim, and he's having a very honest conversation with his mother, who I think we should mention here. The name of the actress again, Magellan, if you don't.
Olivia de Havilland passed away on the day that we're recording this episode.
Yeah,
actually. And
she plays Jim's mom.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty well-known actress of the time. I think he was like 102 years old.
104.
104. Damn.
Yeah.
Dang. And so he's talking to her, and they have this pretty like, honest conversation that's like, I'm back. I'm happy to be back. I love this woman. I never stopped loving this woman. And I don't think it has to do anything with the color of her skin. And again, just like...
And he's like, but I do miss and this is a quote, the absolute God-given assurance of being white. Oof. Certainly missed that. It's like, okay.
Jim.
Yeah.
It's a free it's not a free house for you, Jim. It's a free society for you, Jim, because you're white. I thought that part was really telling, that he's like, I do love her, but also,
Yeah, and the mom is like, oh, well, I thought that you just were trying to make us suffer and like do the thing that would hurt us the most, your parents. And it's like, whoa, okay, this is all sorts of fucked up. And then the really kind of uh-oh moment is when there's a voice that goes, Daddy, Papa, who's this woman?
Who's this white lady? It was in the preview for this episode. It was like, who's this white lady that just came in?
Yeah, and he goes to his son and he says, this white lady is, and we get a shot of Olivia de Havilland, and she might as well have been shaking her head and mouthing no.
Like, don't say it.
The expression that she gives is like, ugh. And he says, this woman is just visiting. And then he's like, oh, the son's like, I want Mom to tuck me into bed. And then it was kind of odd to me.
Yeah, that she's like, I'll do it.
Yeah, because then, his grandma, he doesn't know it's his grandma. She's like, would you like me to tuck you into bed? And he's like, no. I don't know who you are, lady. You're just like a creepy old white lady.
He has no reason to trust her. It's a little sad, I guess, but like, this is more of the like, I don't care about the white people plot lines in this story very much.
Yeah, it's more like I don't. My heart doesn't ache for anyone in that scene except for the kid.
Yeah.
But like, hey, old lady, you made your bed, and now this is the price.
You don't get to have a grandkid,
right?
Which comes back later with the Colonel as well,
right? Because later the Colonel sees Tom Harvey with his grandson, and he's like, hey, I heard the news that your daughter gave birth to your grandfather. It must be a pretty great thing to be a grandfather. And Tom Harvey's literally holding hands with the Colonel's grandson right in front of him.
So, yeah, that would be weird.
Yeah. And we get this really cool shot of them like clenching each other's hands even tighter.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's powerful.
And even more powerful as we transition back to the Lee plotline stuff. If you thought that like violence against Black folks was now happening in the background and not publicly, we visit Lee Garnett in prison, and Tom is absolutely horrified, and all of his PTSD is triggered at the same time as he sees men who were prisoners being worked to the bone, being whipped exactly like the old times.
Yep.
I can't imagine something more. I can't even fathom anything being that traumatizing and triggering for someone.
Right.
Like, that's just the worst thing you've ever seen. I mean, later, like when they, at the wedding, Irene is very quickly like, I haven't seen this in a while. I thought, like, I know how to fix this because I dealt with it a lot, like the scars, but I thought I was never going to have to see this again, and that sucks. Yeah. Ultimately, the thing that's always worth mentioning that we do need, I feel a need to say every episode, is that we as who Majan and I are can't speak to what it must be like to have our ancestors, be enslaved people like this. And neither of us are black. Neither of us are people of color. It's not our experience, but it's one that we empathize with and hope to work against and end in our lifetime if we can.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a long process, and it's not our story to tell, but it's our story to talk about as well as everyone else. So Colonel Warner, who's older now and wears his Confederate uniform around for fun, and his terrible son, Andy, are trying to negotiate with Tom to help release Lee Garnett. But Andy later confides to his dad, like, wait, aren't we never going to release him? Because that's how this works. Mm-hmm. And it's just the show saying the quiet part out loud, being like, yeah, they're not good white people. There's no such thing as good white people.
Yeah.
And Andrew's like, Dad, it kind of like calls to mind sort of a ghastly version of old George from Roots, where he's like, yeah, I do deserve more in life. I'm tired of being unemployed and just sleeping around. I'm gonna run for office. And he's like, good for you, son. I'll make sure you get connections. And he goes, fuck you, Dad. I'm running against you on a platform of disenfranchising black folks. I got the vote.
Yeah.
Just awful.
This was kind of a telling. So just to fast forward to that scene, we have this scene where first of all, kind of a dorky choice by the screenwriter to have Andy pacing around to himself, and he's saying like honorable men and stuff, like clearly trying to evoke Julius Caesar.
Yep.
And be like, oh, this young guy's the Mark Antony and his dad is Brutus or whatever. And it's like, okay, I guess that's kind of cheesy, but anyway. So we have the scene where Andy gets in front of the crowd and he's like, hey, I'm gonna get rid of their right to vote. That's what's gonna happen. White people forever, basically. And he's like, haha, I got him. I trapped my dad. He's not gonna play to this crowd. And it kind of had me thinking about like the modern Republican Party and about Colonel Warner as a sort of like like a John McCain kind of figure.
Sure. Yeah, the war veteran.
Well, the war veteran and like the guy who, everyone is kind of like, oh, he's an honorable dude. He's cool. Sharing the party with someone who's like a Trump or even a Ted Cruz or a, Tucker Carlson or someone like that, who's like much more vocal about the scapegoating and the prejudice and the dangerous racist ideology. And I was just sort of thinking about that as like, this is kind of emblematic of a similar shift that's happening in the Republican Party, where you have an older group of politicians who are like, oh, you just have to play the game and like play nice with people, and that's politics. And a newer generation who's like, yeah, or we could just like say, fuck these people and like white
throw
supremacy.
On the white hoods.
And then the older generation sees the crowd getting riled up by that. And they're like, oh, that's where the action is. Let me go out there. And then Colonel Warner is basically like, hey, all that stuff that my son said, I'm going to do that too. So you still like me, right? And the crowd is like, yeah, sure. Whoever does it. And you can definitely feel that shift happening, I think, in modern politics.
I like this tangent and I want to push on it just a teensy bit more, but like one of the sort of my critiques of Roots is that it paints like the average like voting white person as like hopelessly ignorant and hopelessly like willing to follow whoever gives them the most like power. And while there is obviously a lot of accuracy in that, and the show is not about those people, this is like, the character of tertiary white voters is like not important to the story of Roots really that much, but they are the ones in power who are like making decisions that are keeping the characters that we do care about enslaved in different ways.
Yeah.
But I just think that overall, it's like when people talk today about like ignorant people from the South, I thought a lot about that in this episode and how like America developed this identity where like it got comfortable with itself by accepting that like, oh, those guys they're ignorant. We don't talk about them. And that's obviously extremely problematic and still prevalent today. And like, where did that even come from? Because obviously, like, you know, in ways it comes from people talking the Civil War and the Unions and the Confederates, but they were Confederates in the North and they were Union in the South. Like, the line is being drawn in kind of, I think, a little bit arbitrarily. I don't know enough about history.
Yeah, I think we still see that today when people talk about like Trump voters and Trump country
or like idiots in like the Florida man thing.
Yeah, right. And so we have this conception of like those, it's a bunch of hicks or whatever, and they have bad politics and they're ignorant and we're smarter than them. And it really stymies a sort of like empathetic understanding and also keeps people from recognizing how those problems exist in the North or exist in the middle class or exist in the upper class or exist among liberal white people and those kinds of things. So it's an oversimplification that leads us to miss a lot of things.
Yeah.
But also I think that this depiction of this like angry mob who wants to restrict the votes of African American people is probably historically accurate.
Yes. Yeah.
And this episode does another of the Roots things again, where they basically have the white characters meet in a back room and say like, okay, how are we going to do white supremacy now, gentlemen?
What's a good idea for our white supremacy meeting, boy?
And they're like, well, this is what people are doing now. So it's a little didactic and kind of dorky the way that it was in the episode they were talking about sharecropping. But it's a good educational tool, I think, where they're talking about the different ways that the 15th Amendment is violated during this period of time and African Americans are disenfranchised. So they name a couple of methods. They talk about the poll tax, which is essentially an amount of money that you would have to pay to be able to vote or register to vote. Then there's and sometimes those poll taxes were waived for poor white voters, for example.
Yeah.
Then there were literacy tests, and we actually see this really, really, really amazing scene. I think it was my favorite scene of the two episodes, where Tom Harvey goes in to vote, and he's like, "They're not going to stop me from voting. I've been voting for 10 years." Like, it's just another example of Tom Harvey having faith in institutions and being fucked over because of it. Where he's like, I'll just go in there and vote. So he goes in and they're like, you got to pay the poll tax. And he's like, okay, I did. Look, I've been paying
Oh my God, this scene. Oh, yeah. I fell out of my seat at this scene. It's so intense.
And then they are like, okay, now you got to do the literacy test. And the way that would go is different literacy tests were employed in different places in different ways. Some had written tests, where either like the time limit was insanely short and or the questions were worded in a way that were like confusing or contradictory so that the person scoring the test could sort of decide who was right and who was wrong, basically.
Right.
But another practice that we see here is some states would say that the person who's screening people would have to also, some of those people screening people could just assume that someone was literate, right?
Right.
It's sort of like carding someone at a bar. Like you can just say, oh, they look old enough. And for them, it's like, oh, they're white. They are probably literate. But if they're giving the literacy test more universally, they might be told like, okay, you have to give this person a snippet of the state constitution to read. And that's what happens to Tom Harvey. And I sort of do this thing in my class where I say like, okay, and here's the snippet of the Constitution that a white person might get. And it's a sentence that is like, this Constitution establishes the state of Tennessee as a state or something like that. And then the part that's given to a black person is like, heretofore, forthwith, under this, stricture. And it's like a huge paragraph of legalese that doesn't make sense and is just like winding and confusing. And you're only really going to understand it if you're like a lawyer and you're trained in reading that sort of thing. And then they could say like, okay, you didn't read that one word right, or what they do to Tom Harvey, which is like, cool.
What does it mean?
You sounded it out. You read it. Do you understand it? And he's like, well, and they're like, okay, well, you can't vote. It's so, fucked up doesn't do justice to how deeply unjust that is. But I think that scene is really powerful in just fully putting on display that the system is stacked against African American people, and there isn't like a way to beat it really through the system itself.
It's for Tom Harvey, it's like work 8 times as hard. You're a member of the community, you're well educated, you have a good family and a good business, and you still don't get what everyone else gets because we just decided to.
Yeah. And on the other side of the table is this guy that you've had a political alliance with for a decade.
Who calls you one of his best friends and says that he developed this town in tandem with you and all this stuff. Like, none of that matters when it comes down to it.
And it's like your political organizing that has kept him in power.
Yeah.
And the second that you're not useful to him anymore, it's like, sorry, Tom who?
Who's that? I don't know them.
Yeah.
Infuriating, terrifying, sad, all of that. It even like brings to mind the modern practice of legalese, like you said, and EULAs and insurance forms and paperwork being deliberately complicated. Like, the conversation around signing up for Obamacare even was like, part of this is that like we call it legalized, socialized healthcare, whatever you want, like an early form of that. But the process of like applying to it is about navigating legalese, a broken telephone system, and a system that doesn't want to communicate to you what any of these plans mean, so that the people who can't afford private programs that just throw easy insurance at you, you just can't get that. You have to work hard for the free insurance.
Yeah, and you don't even have to look beyond voting to see similar things happening today too. States having complex rules about like what kind of ID you're supposed to have to be able to vote. States like purging their voter rolls periodically for no discernible reason. We're living in a time where still people are being systemically and actively disenfranchised. And maybe it's not that there's like literally a poll tax or a literacy test, because now those things are illegal, but the idea still stands. That's still what's happening.
Right. And I think this episode, in a way, maybe for a 1978 audience, but especially for a 2020 audience, reminds us that even though, like, I think at least that, especially probably the two of us, have problems with the modern American voting system. It's deeply unfair and broken and not representative of the people's interests at all. You should still vote because they don't want you to vote in a lot of ways.
Sure. Yeah.
Even if your vote is going to be manipulated and all that stuff, I think it's still valuable that you assert that power that you have as a citizen, regardless of who you are, because you have a voice just like everyone else does, even though that vote is not being used well.
Yeah.
That's my platform that I'm running on.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So yeah, you actually ended up covering most of the scenes I wanted to talk about, so I appreciate that. But also, we get like Will proposing to Cynthia, and the aforementioned scene where he is like, it's his wedding day and they're waiting for hours for him, and they're like, where's Will? Is this guy gonna flake at the last minute? And in reality, he was running to his boss to like get Bob Campbell to get the money that he owes the guy, and runs it to the person that it's owed to in the rain, and then runs to his wedding. And has this cute moment with Cynthia where she's like, why are you so late? He's like, I'm working on my job for you, for the family. And then she's like, you've never told me you love me. And he's like, he just turns to her and he's like, I love you. Okay, stop.
Well,
asking.
first he's like, now's not the time.
Yeah.
And
now's
it's
not
like,
the time.
buddy,
You're
you
at
sure?
your wedding.
This is the time. This is the only time. Oh man,
Very funny. Very much like, what's Will's character? Like, why is he like this?
Yeah, I don't know. He almost felt like Don Drapery to me.
Sure.
Not the sort of like philandering side of Don Draper, but the very much like, oh yes,
a little stoic.
I do business. That's what I do for the family.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't say I love my wife. That's dumb.
Yeah.
I actually thought, I forget if it was, no, it's in this episode. But I'll get to it. I want to mention that this show shouts out Ida B. Wells, and that made my heart smile that they were like referencing that. But before we get there, we have the old dads, including Tom, in the back of the wedding, like passing around a bottle of moonshine. He's like, I thought this was a Christian wedding, and they're like, I was like, I believe in God, but I believe in my right to get fucked up even more. Basically, yeah. Awesome. Love him. Want to be that kind of old man someday.
Pretty good.
And then all this happiness and like, I don't know. I again can't speak to this experience, but just like the dads standing and drinking in the backyard of the wedding is something that I cherish. Like that's just a tradition that I really love.
Yeah.
Lee Garnett stumbles into this wedding, bloodied and battered and bruised and everything, because even though they got the papers to get him out on his charge because it was unfair, even though they did all the right things, the man that had control over that kept the papers in his pocket until he decided that they were done whipping him, and then he was like, all right, now you can go. I'm done with you. So he comes back with all these whipping wounds, and Irene, again, like has to rip his shirt off and be like, okay, here we go again. I haven't done this since I was a kid. They have to dress this guy's whip wounds. It's the worst. And we have like Andy breaking up with his girlfriend or whatever. He's trying to run for office. It's bad. We have that scene that you talked about where his father is like, I love white supremacy too, guys. I'm cool. They both vote on that. Tom is angry. Then we get the amazing voting scene. Again, nothing but shout outs to that. And like, as he's talking about like, I earned my rights to vote, I believe it's Cynthia who's like, Ida Wells is running a newspaper talking about this stuff and how they're trying to disenfranchise us. And look what happened to her. They like burned down her place of work. Yeah. And they're done horrible things to her since she decided to speak out about that.
Ida B. Wells fucking rocks.
She's like so awesome.
I think my favorite historical figure, maybe.
Can you speak to more of the stuff that she's done at least? Because all I've always known about is the, civil rights movement stuff, NAACP, and the newspaper.
Yeah, I mean that's the main thing to know about her is that she was like an incredibly brave investigative journalist who brought a lot of unwanted attention and violence because of the things that she reported on. And she's probably best known for publishing this report called Southern Horrors, where she sort of exposes the epidemic of lynching that ends up taking place in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, where the kind of accepted the accepted truth about lynching at the time, especially by northern white people, is the idea of like, okay, I've heard it's maybe happening, but I've also heard that in each of those cases it was an African-American man who raped a white woman. And so like, okay, I don't think it's great, but obviously it seems justified. And Ida B. Wells does a lot of work to dispel the lies of that by saying like, that's not what happened in these cases, that those are false charges that are brought against black men as a pretense to murder them. And so she really was one of the leading voices in exposing and pushing back against the epidemic of lynching. And there's this amazing quote that I use from her in class every year, where, to paraphrase, basically she says, like, here are all the rights that were promised to African American people. Here are all the things that are happening. There's disenfranchisement, there's segregation, there's violence, there's there's sharecropping, there's all of these different things that are making it such that the condition of African American people has either not changed since slavery or in some demonstrable ways has gotten worse and more dangerous.
Right.
So she's just really fucking cool.
Yeah. People should read more about her, honestly. She's one of those historical figures that every once in a while people bump into. And like, I just thought it was great that they mentioned her in this. And I'm like, okay, people like, they're not forgetting about her, because I was not taught about her in school at all. And
I don't think I was either.
You know, it's like, okay, she's super important. Investigative journalism rules and all the other stuff. It's, yeah. So, yeah, the voting scene happens. And then the show kind of does this weird, the miniseries does this weird thing where we know that the problems that are happening to Tom matter, but the show, like, we keep talking about the handoff, right? Like, how do we go from one generation to the next?
Yeah.
This is like probably the sloppiest handoff to me, because we know that the Will storyline is not going to end necessarily happily. We know this is a story about like his business being manipulated against him to continue to take away his power and his wealth. But so actually, before we get to the Will stuff that precedes the end of the episode, horrifying sequence, the white folks the next day chase down Lee Garnett because they're not happy with the results of him being free, and they're not done with him, and he's burned against the tree. It feels like one of those scenes that I wish they talked about more. I wish the characters like talked about what's happening. Yeah. It's pretty quiet. It's mostly just like the action of it happens. Everyone buries him. They're sad about it. And then snap your fingers. Hey, Will, you want to have a whole business? And it's like, wait, that was important. Why?
Yeah. Well, it's also important to recognize sort of what the things that enable that to take place.
Exactly.
Because there's the moment where Lee Garnett pulls a gun on, or maybe he does. I wasn't closely watching the scenes. So that also could have just been a lie.
I think he no, I don't think he pulls it out. I think that they see it, because he turns around and like from like going up to the guys, and then Tom goes, "What is that in your hand?" And he's like, "It's a gun. I was going to shoot them." And he's like, "Don't fucking shoot them." And he goes, "Okay, I won't."
Yeah.
And then they still are like, "We saw it. Didn't you guys see it? You all saw it, right? He pulled it out on me and aimed it at me." Like, they're clearly lying.
They're exaggerating. So they go to the colonel, and they're like, "Those guys, came here to have a fight, basically." And the colonel's like, "Well, they didn't do anything, so we can't do anything to them." And then they say, "Oh, but that one guy pulled a gun on us." And then the colonel's like, "Well, if that's true, then I guess he deserves whatever's coming to them." And they are like, "Whoa, did you hear that? All right, cool." Basically,
the colonel said we can do it.
Mayor of the town is giving permission, just like the judge guy in the last episode is essentially giving permission to these terrorists to go and murder someone.
And he's just he's horribly murdered, and they have to get past that. And this is again one of those where I was like, maybe it's within the scope of this episode that's already going long, but we just pivot. It's like basically a camera cut from like, wow, that was really awful, and they bury him and they do all that stuff. It is, they address the fact that he died, but right away then we have Will going into the office of the people who I guess run the town, and they're like, "Hey, so Bob Campbell's a terrible, terrible business owner. We know that. You're great. We're really happy that you came up and worked so hard. You didn't tell me it was your wedding night, Will. God damn it." And it's like, "Yeah, it was my wedding night. I do need this job or else I can't live." And they're like, "Listen, he foreclosed. We're going to give you an amazing, brilliant business opportunity. What would you say if I told you that you could own your business, you own this whole business? Do you want to sign now or what?" And he's like, and he's like so happy. Music gets all happy, and we cut to the R. Campbell the R. Campbell Lumber Company is now the W.E. Palmer Lumber Company. And it's like, wow. So Will's like one of the first important black business owners of this area. That's really great. But right under the backdrop of like all of the other characters congratulating him for having his first child be born, he's talking to Tom about how stressed he is, that what that business deal really meant was they gave him all of the debts that Campbell had and increased the interest on all of them so he would never pay them off. Have you heard of this before? It keeps happening. Like, that's the one like plot thread that I was like, ooh, I really wanted to see the end of that. Or however, because his whole thing is like, I'm not going to take this lying down. I'm going to earn more money than they can bill me for. But he has a kid with Cynthia named Bertha George, And Tom takes the child outside and does the other Roots thing, which is that he holds him up to the stars, just like Omuro did to Kunta Kinte so many years ago. And it's very nice. And then we get the sort of like modern like record scratch moment where his wife is like, why are you doing that? Why did your dad do that? Why did Chicken George do that when you were born? And he says, it's just something in the family. As we call it a close on part 2 of Next Generations. I kind of wish I didn't watch the preview of the next episode, Magellan, because I don't know. I was like, I don't know what's going to be next. And then they're like, the war. And I'm like, oh shit, the war. I forgot. But I'm really excited to see them handle the world wars and the 20th century now. So you want to give me some delicious plot summaries of what's going to happen in parts 3 and 4 of Roots the Next Gen?
Sure, I'd love to.
Thank you.
All right. Next time on RootsChatz, we are watching episodes 3 and 4 of Roots the Next Generations. First, episode 3. 17 years later, Will Palmer prospers as the owner of the lumber company.
Hell yeah.
Then, episode 4. Simon Haley spends World War I with the 92nd Infantry, colored in France.
Oh.
On his return to the States, Simon and his buddies Doxy and Haywood are greeted by a lynch mob in Knoxville, Tennessee.
Boy.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, excited to talk about Black infantry and the idea of the like often under-discussed topic of African Americans being used in the world wars. But that'll be a conversation in and of itself. So yeah, more Roots, guys. It'll be great. It'll be a lot of interesting fun. I'm honestly having such a great time talking about the history of it. I mean, this is a heartbreaking, sad show, and so is history. But you got to talk about this stuff at some point. And yeah.
You want to learn a frustrating piece of trivia that I just accidentally stumbled upon?
I do, actually.
So George Stanford Brown,
yep,
who plays Tom Harvey.
Tom Harvey, yep.
Was nominated for an Emmy for his work as Tom Harvey in the miniseries Roots, but that year the Academy decided to change the number of nominees from 6 to 5, and his nomination was revoked.
Oh. Why?
That's some bullshit right there.
It smells... What is that? Oh, that's racism.
Right.
Got it, okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Well... That does suck, but he did great work on the show, and I think he definitely deserved an Emmy. A lot of people on the show honestly deserved Emmys.
Yeah, I agree.
You want to take it to the plugs now, John?
Let's do it. So there are a number of ways that you can get in contact with the show. You can email us, chatzpod@gmail.com. You can follow us on Twitter, twitter.com/chatzpod. You can also join the Reddit community of folks who like to discuss previous and current Chats episodes over at reddit.com/r/chatspod. All of those are spelled CHATZPOD. If you'd like to support the show and you're not already doing so, you can head on over to patreon.com/chatspod. And there are a couple of fun things to find over there. So you can support us at $1 a month and get access to the Chats files, as well as some old movie commentaries. $3 a month gets you access to all of our current and new bonus content 3 times a month, which could include us piloting shows, watching movies, or just talking about whatever we want to. And then at $5 a month, you get access to the full backlog of bonus content stuff and our gratitude. And we love you, and we really appreciate you if you do that. And we've been saying this throughout RootsChatz, but it remains true that if you believe that your money is better spent other places, if you'd like to support causes for social and racial justice and then just show us that you've done that, then we can give you a link to access all of our Patreon stuff as a sort of gesture of gratitude for you choosing to spend your money that way, which we want to support and we appreciate.
Indeed, Magellan, and thank you for reminding the folks about that.
Yeah. And then we always like to end our episodes here by just talking about what we've been enjoying the past few days, what you could consider enjoying or consuming. I don't like that word, so I'll just say enjoying between now and next time. And those are called chatsums. So, Alan, any chatsums for the folks?
Yes, sir. I actually have 2 chatsums this week.
Wow, me too.
Wow. Yeah, so big chunky chatsums. That's gross. I'm sorry I said it that way. One is so I follow a couple of film essay channels, and and one of the ones I follow put out a video recently with the sort of subheading "One Excellent Scene." That's X-CELLENT, and it was a like in-depth film analysis of a specific scene from X-Men: The Last Stand. The channel that I followed is Now You See It, which might have been one of my previous chatsums a long time ago. But he talked about the scene in X-Men: The Last Stand where they go to the president's office and they go to the Oval Office is what that's called, and talk about like how it's building on all of the other scenes around the White House and how all the X-Men, it's like a culmination scene, how brilliant it is. And I was like, that's really cool. I really like that this guy decided to do that. And what I learned is that One Excellent Scene was a sort of like group effort from a ton of different film YouTube channels. All on July 23rd, they all put out their One Excellent Scene videos on different scenes from the X-Men movies. So I don't even think I can count how many there are. There's like 20 plus videos. All of them are like 10 minutes long each or something. And people don't talk about the cinematic competency of the X-Men films. I mean, they're not perfect films, but what I love about watching these videos, I haven't watched a ton of them, but like, those movies have problems, but when you're a film critic, when you're a critic in general, you have to take a specific lens to something. So like, there's one that's about the role of space in X-Men First Class, and how there's a scene where the kids in First Class go to like their dorm for the first time, and they all get to hang out, and then they get in trouble because like Sebastian Shaw comes in and kills one of them, and like how it like he interferes in the space, and it's like, wow, that's so clever. And one of the people in the comments rightfully mentioned like, you can focus on the space, and you could take a whole different read of that scene and how fucked up it is that the first person they kill is the one black X-Man in First Class, is that they're like, oh, this guy does, like, we just blow him up, and how those movies like often will take the characters of color and just be like, that doesn't matter, or you die for everyone else to live. Like, you can take a positive or negative or any sort of lens to any like snapshot of a movie, regardless of its quality, and discuss it professionally. So it's just a really fascinating take on like how deep can you go on these movies that honestly don't get talked about in critical circles that much anymore. So you can just type into YouTube One Excellent Scene, I spelled it earlier, and just fall down that fun rabbit hole like I did this week.
Nice.
The other one is a chatsum for a video game that I started playing today, and the game is called Hard Space: Shipbreaker. And it's a game that takes place it's in the Homeworld universe, so old PC gamers will recognize Homeworld as a strategy franchise. But Hard Space Shipbreaker has a great premise that chats folks and people who gel with our like political standing will definitely like. The idea is that you are a person who's working as a shipbreaker, which means that you're someone who goes to abandoned, like busted, broken down ships in this like fantasy sci-fi world, and you crack into them using like different cutting tools to like get the money inside. Like if people remember, if people listen to Pilot Chats and listen to us talk about the Firefly pilot, the stuff they do at the beginning of the pilot is what this game is about, where it's like, ooh, what kind of money am I going to find inside of an old dead ship? So you get to do that stuff, but it's wrapped up in this idea that you're paying off your debt. You are somebody who in this like future is owned by a corporation, your body's owned by them. And these like shipbreaks are super duper dangerous. Like you are dealing with like nuclear weapons and stuff like that. It's like been decommissioned but might still be active, and like cutting into it with like a molten laser. And so, you can die in this game pretty easily. But the thing that's like the sort of like, I guess, critique on society thing, when you die, the company still has a lease on your life, so they just clone you and bill you for your clone. So you every time you finish a mission, the game is like, you have $100 million loan. You just took off $100 off of it, but we're gonna minus another $5. We're gonna add another $5 million because you died once. So it's this kind of like, you can already see the sort of gears turning of like, oh, capitalism like gives you a loan so that you can't pay it off and all that stuff. That idea is like really scary and sad, but there's something empowering about being able to control that in a video game space and be like, I'm doing this, and like, what does it say about the world that I'm able to do this and survive these horrible situations? It's really fascinating, and if you have a computer that can run it, it's in early access right now, so it's still pretty rough, but I think there's a really cool core game in there. And again, that game is called Hard Space Shipbreaker. Cool. But John, what do you got for chats this week?
I have two things that I've been watching on Netflix that I'm
Whoa.
pretty late to. One of them I'm like a couple months or a month late to, and one of them I'm like years late to.
A decade late too.
So maybe people have seen these or formed opinions about them before. But the first thing is I just finished today the miniseries The Last Dance about the last season of the amazing Michael Jordan Chicago Bulls team. And I don't really care about sports at all. I don't particularly know a lot about sports. So there was some stuff in it where it was like, okay, I don't fully understand basketball or like what the deal is, but as this story about like a huge pop culture figure and about the kind of pop culture significance of basketball during the early to mid 90s, or to the late 90s even, I found that documentary was like actually really interesting and pretty well made. So I would encourage people to check it out because it's fun and it's cool. I mean, the zeitgeist moment has passed, so you won't be able to see all the tweets that I saw and didn't get at the time, but I still think it's worth a watch.
What about, do they talk about the pizza story?
Yeah, about how he got sick from the pizza.
Yes. Okay, great. That was one of those like bits of
in there.
One of those Michael Jordan ephemeras that I was like, is this real? And apparently someone was like, they addressed the pizza story. And I was like, holy shit.
Yeah. They kind of, it's one of those things where I don't think you're going to learn, if you know a lot of stuff about Michael Jordan, there's like not anything, oh my God, shocking. It's more just like a really well done repackaging of things that you could probably read on a Wikipedia page or something. So I will say it's not like revelatory, but I think that it's a story that's well known, that's well told.
Okay, yeah, that's what I like.
So
it's
worth it for that reason.
And it's on Netflix now.
It's on Netflix now, yeah. And and each episode kind of takes a different approach or talks about a different element of the story. But yeah, so there's that. Then I've been watching this TV series that I'm pretty late on. It started in the year 2000, and it's just a story about a mom and her daughter living in Connecticut and sort of, trying to get by in the world. And
guys, I've been digging for the last half hour and I haven't been able to find the lead that Magellan buried. We're gonna find it together. And what could it possibly be, Magellan?
And it's a story about, it's a single mom. She had her daughter when she was really young, and now her daughter's going to like a new private school. And so it's sort of like navigating that culture and relationship with their family and boys and stuff. And it's called Gilmore Girls.
Wait a minute.
It's a really good show. I've been watching Gilmore Girls off a friend's recommendation, and it's very, very good.
Where is that available?
Netflix.
Oh shit, yeah. Oh, I love Netflix.
You gotta watch. Have you seen it?
I've watched a lot of Gilmore Girls. Not all of it. I've watched a lot of it.
Okay, it's very, very good. It's very well written, and characters are great. It would have been a great chat show. It still could be, but I'm gonna keep watching it.
They what's it called? It's kind of like What If Sorkin was good, because they talk real fast on that show, right?
Yeah. It's like What If Sorkin was a woman and actually knew how to write things that didn't suck.
Oh my God, Gilmore Girls is from the director of But I'm a Cheerleader, seminal queer film But I'm a Cheerleader. Wow. And she worked on Silicon Valley. Wow, I'm learning so much about Jamie Babbitt today. Holy crap, holy. I always remember
Is she one of the directors, or?
Yes, she's the main. She directed 18 episodes of the show. She directed a lot of it. They move directors a lot. She's like one of the ones who directed the most episodes. I digress. Yes, Gilmore Girls rules. One of the first pieces of TV trivia I ever learned was that Alexis Bledel, that was like the first English language show that she worked on, because she wasn't born she was born in Houston, but I think she like grew up speaking Spanish primarily. Oh. So she was like, they put me on the hardest, like fastest talking English show ever.
That's funny.
And I like didn't know that my English wasn't even that good for a while. But yeah, rock and roll. I'm very happy they were checking out that show.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, folks, we hope you all enjoyed this episode of Roots Chats and you learned something and you thought about some stuff. Thank you to Magellan for being the rock to my hard place. And thank you for listening to this episode of Roots Chats. Peace.